In this video, I wanted to show you how I created these persimmon fruit. I used it on my wagashi render, and some people were really interested in them, so I decided to create a walkthrough on how I did it. It's not a full tutorial, but just something to sit back, relax, and get some inspiration. I actually created them from scratch. I was really interested in the persimmon leaves, called the calyx, as I like creating organic materials. This wasn't like any other generic green leaf, but had a lot of interesting mixtures of textures. So I challenged myself to create it from scratch, and here's my process. After some experimentation, I settled on the workflow of using Blender for the modeling and then Substance Painter for the texturing of the stem and leaves. While I use Substance Painter to texture the models, I've provided the base materials for free if you want to download them. Also, if you want to use these persimmons for your own projects, I've also made them available. Links in the description box below. And with that, let's get started. There are two popular types of persimmons, fuyu and hachiya. The bodies look different, but the tops, called the calyx, are the same. Fuyus are shaped like squished rounded cubes, and hachiya are shaped like an acorn. Let's start by making a fuyu persimmon. Start with a sphere of about 7 to 10 centimeters, and with proportional editing on, flatten the top and bottom of the sphere by selecting the very top vertex and moving it downwards. Do the same for the bottom of the body. Here, it's still too round, so I adjusted it by selecting an edge and scaling it outwards. Looking from the side, you want this kind of shape. It's like a rounded rectangle with a strong fall off on the edges. Now, add a subdivision modifier with about 3 divisions. Looking top down, persimmons are not perfectly circular, but rather squarish. To do this, I selected a pair of edges that cross the center point and scaled them outwards only on the X and Y axis. I do this with the corresponding opposite edges. This squares off the shape. Don't make it too squarish, just subtle changes are required. The tops of the persimmons have a depression, so select the topmost vertex and with proportional editing, move it downwards. This entire section will be covered by the calyx. The top of the persimmon also doesn't have a uniform height. The lip has high points between the calyx. For this, I go around the top of our object and select a few vertices, and with proportional editing still on, move them downwards. Looking at our reference again, persimmons have this indent on each of the sides. We can create these features by selecting the 4 edges that cross the center and scaling them inwards. And that's our basic shape. To create the shape for a hachiya persimmon, start with a cube of around 11 centimeters. Add some subdivisions and shade smooth. This creates a rounded cube, which is a perfect starting point. Create a loop cut in the middle of the cube and scale the bottom vertices inwards. Scale the middle edge outwards a bit and add another loop cut at the top. Scale these topmost vertices inwards to create our acorn-like shape. Now create a bunch of loop cuts on the top, and with the centermost faces selected, move it inwards. You just need the rough shape here. Hachiya persimmons also have high points at the top, but we'll add them in with sculpting instead of adjusting vertices like we did with the fuyu persimmon. Finally, regardless of type, you can add more imperfections on your mesh by using a displace modifier. Just make the deformation subtle, since persimmons have a pretty smooth surface. To create the calyx, I first find a top-down image so I can trace out the basic shape. The image should be just enough to get the overall shape since we're going to be creating our own texture, so you don't need any detail in the image. Start with a pane and subdivide 4 times. From here, just move vertices around to trace the overall shape of the calyx. I delete any extra vertices I don't need, usually the ones around the outer edge. So this is what we get, the overall shape of the persimmon calyx. We need a fair bit of geometry since we'll be using texture-based displacement, so add a subdivision modifier with 4 divisions. Persimmon calyx are quite often torn. To make these tears, in edit mode, use the knife tool by pressing K and cut out thin sections of the calyx. You need to keep clicking to create new vertices within a face. Once that's done, in face select mode, delete the area you just carved out. This will leave some n-gons, but don't worry, since we are using a subdivision modifier, the n-gons will be very small and will not have a noticeable effect. The stem and surrounding area is raised, so we want to do this too. Select a few vertices in the middle and with proportional editing, move them upwards. This creates a gentle sloping bump. If you want it to be sharper, in top-down view, move the surrounding vertices inwards. Also, for the vertices you just raised, reshape them into a more circular formation. Apply the subdivision modifier and export to an FBX file. And with that, we are now off to creating the calyx material. I did this in Substance Painter, so I'll show you the general steps I used to make this really interesting texture. Okay, here in Painter, I already created a new project and brought in my model. I first created a fill layer of just olive green. This is like a base undercoat. We're doing a lot of masking and we don't want any of this default gray to bleed through. Next is the main leaf material I created in Substance Designer. It has a color, normal, height, and roughness maps. I already imported this material into Painter. This material actually has a proper orientation as it flares out from the root. This is specific for each point, so I need to paint each leaf one at a time. This is what I mean. For each point, in this case, I'm starting with the top one. I create a new fill layer and orient the material as I need by adjusting the rotation and offset. Since this texture only applies to a single point, I use a black mask and paint the specific area I want the layer to apply to. I do this 3 more times, once for each point, using a new fill layer for each point. This is grouped into a folder for convenience. I now apply the material for the center part of the Persimmon calyx. It has a different texture, so it's a different material altogether. I use a black mask to limit this material to just the middle. For the dried up parts of the calyx, I just use rust, but without the metal channel. I use the levels filter to adjust the color, and then with a black mask, I start painting the edges with various brushes. There's not too much height here, so in the next layer, I start adding height variations. This is a fill layer with the height pushed up to the maximum. In the black mask, I paint again using various brushes. Once that's done, we want to add more height detail. So I created yet another height layer, this time lowering the height all the way. I then use a black mask and paint areas where I want depressions. I use various brushes to create gentle folds and bends in the calyx. After every few brush strokes, I change the rotation to get variations in the patterns. I then change the brush to create sharper creases. For this, I use a brush stroke used to create cracks in concrete. Like before, after every few strokes, I rotated the brush and changed the scale to create variations. As a final bit of detail, I added one more color layer. This is just to add some brown highlights in the calyx. I just created a uniform fill layer, but used a black mask so I can paint the areas I want with a brown hue with a soft brush stroke. You don't need too much of this. So that's basically it. I then exported the textures and imported them into Blender. There isn't anything special here, just import the color, normal, height, and roughness maps. In Render View mode, you should get something like this. While in Rendered View mode, you will see some height variations caused by the height and normal maps. This isn't enough as the Persimmon's calyx are very rough, bumpy, and usually contain many large folds and bends. We need to create this level of distortion using the Displace modifier and the cloud texture. Apply the Displace modifier. This is important as we will be manually displacing the mesh next. In Sculpt mode, with the Grab tool, I created the larger folds and bends in the calyx. You can get pretty aggressive here since real calyx are pretty bent up. The Persimmon's calyx is tightly fitted over the Persimmon body, so we need to rotate the 4 tips downwards. I did this by selecting groups of vertices in Edit mode with X-ray mode on and rotated them. Move the calyx on top, making sure each of the 4 tips fold over the depressions we made in the Persimmon body previously. In Sculpt mode, with the Grab tool, I further deformed the calyx to make the top follow the contours of the body as much as possible. Be careful, you don't want any part of the body poking through the calyx. Finally, make a hole on top of the calyx for the stem. To model the stem, I simplified things and used an existing branch model from one of the many branch or twig models you can find and download for free. For texturing the body, I used a base Persimmon material I created in Substance Designer and then imported it into Painter where I added further details. In the base layer, I did not include height. While this material contained a height map, I created a separate fill layer just so that I can control the impact of the height separately from the rest of the material. Persimmons in grocery stores get pretty roughed up and have dents and blotches throughout their skin. I created a fill layer using just the color of the rust material and a black mask to paint in the blotches and other subtle imperfections. In the final layer, I used the height channel to paint in dents and scratches. That's it for the body texturing. I repeated this for each of the Persimmon models and exported the color, height, normal, and roughness maps from Painter and imported them into Blender. I created a different material for each Persimmon body and used RGB curve and brightness nodes to create slight variations of color. Once everything's put together, I got this final result, which I think looks pretty cool and looks pretty real, even close up. That's it. I hope you liked this walkthrough and took some inspiration for your own projects. Thanks for watching.